Race is a socially constructed concept. It's long been used to categorize people based on characteristics such as skin color, physical features, and lineage. Despite having no biological grounding, race has profoundly shaped societal structures, conferring some with privilege while oppressing others. So today we're going to talk about it. Who made you black? And if you like stories like this, you can find more stories like this at OneMicHistory.com. But without further ado, let's get started. The modern concept of race took root in America's formidable years. European explorers and settlers used these terms without the connotations that they carry today. In the late 16th century, the English language was just beginning to incorporate the term race. It wasn't yet laden with the same weight that it carries today. Shakespeare, for instance, would use words like a race of saints or race of bishops, using the term to denote broad categories rather than rigid classifications. During the 17th, 18th century, saw a rise of European enlightenment. This was an era of secular reasoning and scientific inquiry. Enlightenment thinkers sought to classify and understand their world. In doing so, they applied this methodology to human societies. This led to the construction of racial hierarchies that placed themselves as white people at the pinnacle of human achievement. As the concept of race would continue to evolve, it became a powerful means of categorizing and ranking people. In America, Europeans considered themselves a superior free class, while American Indians were subdued natives and Africans were forcibly enslaved. These racial distinctions eventually became formalized, laying the groundwork for societal structures that would permeate every facet of America with discrimination and inequality. In colonial America, they faced a severe labor shortage. After establishing the struggling outpost in Jamestown, planters relied heavily on indentured servitude. These men and women endured harsh conditions to repay their debt for their passage to the New World, often for 4 to 7 years. However, this steady influx of laborers from England had begun to decline, prompting colonial leaders to seek alternative means to maintain their stranglehold on the working class and secure a reliable labor force. Their solution was to stratify the society in racial categories, culminating in permanent African slavery. A pivotal legal moment of this is in 1662 with Virginia and their hereditary slave law. This law decreed that the children born to enslaved women would inherit their mother's bonded status. This not only condemned the children to a life of slavery, but also established the foundation of chattel slavery and ingrained this anti-black sentiment into American society. As laws tightened around African and African descended people, condemning them to a life of perpetual servitude, concurrently, European settlers began to identify as white, and that status conferred privilege such as land and resources, and only deepened the societal divisions. By the 18th century, influential philosophers like Voltaire and Thomas Jefferson published assertions of the Africans inherently inferior. These views, often based on subjective impressions and secondhand reports, mirrored the prevailing attitudes and economic interests tied to the lucrative slave trade. Scholars began to promote the view that black people, then referred to as Negroes, were inherently inferior to whites. The American Revolution and the birth of the Constitution would further crystallize this racial hierarchy. The institution of slavery was enforced and property protections were extended to the enslaved population. Virginia leaders acted decisively to entrench these racial divisions. They passed laws that separated Europeans from Indians and Africans, fostering contempt between whites and blacks. During this time, even freed African Americans were stripped of their voting rights and civil liberties as colonial leaders solidified this unequal society based on physical appearances. Prominent figures like Edward Long and Charles White would add pseudoscientific weight to these beliefs, describing Africans as a separate, subordinate species. Their ideas supported slavery as a natural and moral institution. This period also entrenched the notion that enslaved people were property, and thus property rights overshadowed basic human rights. During the 1830s, Dr. Samuel Morton emerged as a prominent figure in American anthropology. Morton measured skulls from various populations claiming to find evidence that black people have smaller brains compared to whites, with indigenous people falling somewhere in between. He fiercely supported the ideology of racial hierarchies and attracted significant attention. Morton's involvement in the debate over human creation further underscored the era's tensions, really deep societal divides over whether black people and white people were products of a single creation or multiple creations. This exaggerated narrative of racial differences led many to perceive black individuals as a completely different and inherently inferior species. These entrenched racial ideologies culminated in the Supreme Court's 1857 ruling in the Dred Scott versus Sanford case, which declared that black people could not be U.S. citizens and that enslaved people were property. This decision etched anti-black sentiment into the nation's legal framework, ensuring that racial divisions remain the cornerstone of American society. The abolishment of slavery following the Civil War didn't mark the end of racial exploitation in America. Instead, systems like sharecropping and Jim Crow segregation continued to oppress black populations. In the South, white society fervently resisted any change, striving to maintain this racial hierarchy that marginalized non-white populations. In the landmark Supreme Court Plessy versus Ferguson decision, Wood institutionalized separate but equal, affirming legal white supremacy and deepening America's racial divisions. The 19th century also saw a rise in scientific racism, which provided a veneer of legitimacy of societal racism. Eugenics marked an example of this pseudoscientific theory, promoting the notion of the biological superiority of white people. Public exhibitions like the anthropology exhibit at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair reinforced these racial hierarchies. Laws, societal norms perpetuated the idea that the true American identity was closely tied to white identity. During this time, in the early part of the 19th century, saw large migrations from Southern and Eastern Europe and began to challenge America's racial ranking system. Established white Americans like the English, Dutch, German, Scandinavian descendants were alarmed at the influx of people speaking Italian, Greek, Hungarian, Russian, and other foreign languages. Their widespread belief that these new races could not be assimilated into the Anglo-Saxon culture prompted policies and practices aimed at maintaining racial segregation from these new immigrants. Despite the opposition, these European immigrants gradually lost their status as inferior races. Their descendants were eventually assimilated into white culture, adopting the prevailing white racial worldview. As European empires expanded during the same time period, the concept of race became deeply embedded across colonies. The physical differences of conquered and colonized people reinforced the notion of European racial superiority. This racial worldview was employed to justify the extermination of various groups of people, such as the Tasmanians and many indigenous Australians. This was an essential component of the colonial policies and practices in British-controlled regions such as India, South Asia, and later Africa. In the end, it was Americans that gave birth to the concept of black, white, and this racial divide. Americans gave birth to the world's only slave system that was defined exclusively by race. By assigning Africans and their descendants to perpetual servitude, colonists could ensure that black people permanently occupied society's lowest rung. Through the enforcement of societal separations, they guaranteed that physical difference remained stark indicators of this unequal social status. Thus, race became a construct that embodied segregation and inequality and would even outlive the institution of slavery that created it. Thank you. I'm your host, Country Boy, and this was One Mic Black History, and this has been a story of race. If you like stories like this, you can find more stories like this at OneMicHistory.com. If you'd like to support the channel, you can do so on Buy Me Coffee Patreon page in the description below. Thank you for all my Patreon subscribers and my members. I love all of you. Without you, none of this could be possible. And peace.